getting a sense of deja vu. Like, haven't we done all this before? Can we just skip the scary headlines and stories based on falsehoods and exaggeration? Can we not waste time creating material for, those montages that we'll look back on in 20 years' time and think, what the hell were they thinking? Can't we just skip the crazy bit and fast forward to the part where we all just get along?
I already know what your first question is going to be. Why is a privileged white male hosting a podcast on women in film? And it's a valid question in the current climate. But the answer is simple, and it's one often overlooked. Many of us believe in this fight, not just for women's rights, but for social justice, equality, and the inclusion of all. That's why I'm doing this. Because I host a podcast that caters to males ages 40 to 60. And how else are they to hear these stories? In what other venue will they possibly be exposed to the struggles faced by women and other minorities unless we reach out to them where they congregate? I am Mark Ritchie, host of Crypticast Series 2, a serial podcast focused on women in film from inception to modern day. Let's start by going back in time about 40 years or so. It's the 1980s, the age of the power suit. Women are taking charge in the workforce. Things are looking up. At least, that's what we were told. But was that really the case? I mean, honestly, had we finally figured out the solution to the equality issue?
I went to film school in New York. I went to NYU graduate film school in the early 80s.
This is Allison McMahon, award-winning documentary filmmaker.
My graduate film school class at NYU in film production was a class of 88 people, and only 6 of us were women. And they over-admitted in the first year. I don't think they do this anymore, but at the time that's how they did it. They would over-admit, and then they would drop 20% of the class automatically at the end of the first year. And they dropped almost all the women. And they didn't drop me, and they tried to tell me that that's because I was better than some of the others, but I know that that's not true. Now, classes at NYU and all the other film schools have more women than men. A lot of them are foreigners, but it's at least 50-50, if not more women than men. So things have changed a lot, but in my day, that was a serious problem. One of the reasons why they dropped all the women at NYU is that they were convinced that women couldn't carry their own equipment because we're such, fragile little wallflowers. We can't carry our own cameras, right?
Wait. I grew up in the 1980s, and this was not the narrative we were sold.
The other problem I had in film school is that I couldn't get male crew. Unless I was actually dating somebody, he would not work on my film. And it was up to you to find, students had to work on each other's films, and everyone would want to work for the people who had the most money because they could rent the most toys, and those of us who just had the budget that the, school called for and didn't have anything extra. In the end, to do my thesis film, I had to search out other female alumni. There was 1 or 2 per class in the few years preceding me, and get them to work on my film. I had almost no people from my class who were willing to work with me, even though I had worked on their films. So there was this sort of assumption that just because you were a girl, you weren't going to make it. So there was no point trying to help you out, no point trying to establish a relationship with you because it wasn't going to pay off in the future. And then that becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
This wasn't just the plight faced by Allison McMahon in the 1980s. This was what women had faced across the board in many industries. The true success stories were few and far between. Those are the stories that we were fed to make us believe all was right with the world. Those few inspirational success stories were the women we were told to look up to. Oprah Winfrey, Sally Ride, Cher, Sandra Day O'Connor. These women became the role models for future generations. Madonna, Benazir Bhutto, Florence Griffith Joyner, Margaret Thatcher. All representation in music, sports, politics, television. But where were the triumphant stories that could have been centered around female filmmakers of the time? Filmmakers like Amy Heckerling or Susan Seidelman, or even Penny Marshall or Catherine Bigelow, all of whom were making films during the 80s. So why was the film industry lagging behind? In order to uncover that truth, we had to go back to the very beginning.
Silent cinema, one of the reasons why I was attracted to it to begin with is I was this baby feminist in the late 70s, early 80s, and I had read, what was it, Maya Angelou, who said, you can't rebuild the master's house with the master's tools. So the idea in feminist narrative theory was that we couldn't tell stories about ourselves, about women, about other minority voices, using the same narrative formats that had always been, including classical Hollywood cinematic narrative. And then I was reading something by Christian Metz, and one of the things he said was that silent cinema was written from a linguistic perspective, was written in a different language from the cinema that we know today. So I said, well, maybe that's the answer to my question. I'll look at silent cinema and I'll find a language for telling our stories today, these stories that need to be told that aren't being told in a way, that reflects, our perspective and not the dominant patriarchal perspective or whatever you want to call it. And so I started looking at silent cinema, and I just assumed I would find all sorts of wonderful female role models. And of course, I discovered that there was only one.
And that role model was L.L.C. Blanchet, a French filmmaker whose true story many of you have probably never heard until now.
How did she manage to get a job where she could make films before movies were even invented? How did she end up at the forefront of the industry? How did she start her own company? How did she manage to do that and still be married happily for at least 15 years and then have children and be a mom, especially back then when she couldn't even vote until 1945? I mean, she was almost retirement age by the time she could vote in France. How did she do it?
And that is what we are here to discuss today. The historic record has it wrong, and it's time the world understand the full story behind the mother of not just cinema, but of film narrative as we know it. And for this journey, we are grateful to have with us Alison McMahon, author of the compelling biography entitled Lost Visionary of the Cinema, the true story of Alice Guy Blanchet's rise to become the first female studio head in the world, only to later be expunged from the cinematic record. Here is Alison on why this story had to be told.
The reason why I wanted to write the book is I was a subscriber to a magazine called Premiere, I think it was. And, I was at home with a baby and the mail arrives and I open the door. I have my little baby girl in my arms and I opened the Premiere magazine that just came in the mail, and they have the whole lineup, like the slate of films coming out for the summer, all the tentpole films. And none of them, not one, was directed or even produced by a woman. Not a single one. And I looked down at my little baby and I thought, what kind of world is she going to grow up in where all the movies that I'll be taking her to see 5 years from now, when she's old enough to sit still long enough in the theater, none of them are made by women. And then I thought, well, how do you encourage women to make films? Well, you have to give them role models. Well, who's my role model? My role model is Alice Guy Blanchet, but I'm the only one who knows about her. So, I had to write the book.
And so begins our journey on the life of Alice Guy Blanchet.
She was the first woman filmmaker in the whole world. She was the only woman filmmaker, as far as we know, but a lot of research has been done, so we're pretty sure about this. the only woman filmmaker working as a professional for the first 12 years of cinematic history. The second one was Lois Weber, who got started by working for L.L.C. And Lois Weber was the first American filmmaker.
If you are a film buff, then the red letter date of March 22nd, 1885 should be singed into your memory. This was the date on which the first public screening of a film reel was ever presented to a live audience by the Lumiere brothers. And Alice was there.
The Lumieres had an exhibition of their movie camera where they only showed one film, The Workers Leaving the Factory, and all the industry people were there.
This included engineer-turned-inventor Léon Gaumont, Alice's employer, and later in 1897, head of the Gaumont Film Company, which is still in existence today.
Gaumont came out and said to Alice, we've got to move on this and start working on our own camera. And Alice said to him, these films that they're making, like The Workers Leaving the Factory was the workers at the Lumiere shoe factory. So you could say that the first film of note in the historical record was actually a commercial. And right away, she said, well, why don't we use this device to tell a story? And Gaumont said, if you want to, you can, but don't let it interfere with your secretarial work. Now, this was actually a huge imposition because she was already working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Those were normal working hours at the time. In order to make her first film, La Fée aux Choux, The Cabbage Fairy, she would have to leave the Gaumont office, which was near the Place de l'Opéra in Paris, and take a trolley all the way up to Belleville, where the Gaumont labs were, film there outdoors because he hadn't built a film studio yet. This was before the idea of that being important had even entered Gaumont's consciousness. So she would film during her lunch break. The Europeans have fairly long lunch breaks, 2 hours or so. So she would take an extended lunch, 3 to 4 hours. Remember, the trolley ride ate up like 45 minutes of that each way. And then film, and then she would, or prepared to film, like look for costumes and stuff. And then she would go back to the office and work until 11 or 12 at night to catch up on all the secretarial work that she had to do.
It was the birth of independent film school as we know it. A young, up-and-coming filmmaker holding down a day job while building what would become a full-fledged film production career. The plethora of knowledge that Alice would gain as Gaumont's secretary at the then L.L.C. and later as Gaumont's head of production at the renamed Gaumont Film Company would prove invaluable.
So Alice starts as a secretary in 1894. In 1895, Gaumont buys the company and he promotes her and gives her a salary raise, and she's basically running the whole office at that point. Any contract, any letter, any conference notes, any business meeting, she's at every business meeting taking down the steno notes, then she's writing up the minutes. She's doing all of that paperwork. So has a front row seat to watch all these business deals happen. And then her job, she's also like, her desk is the first desk that people would see, the clients, when they came in to buy a camera. So there was a period of 2 or 3 years where she's still doing all the secretarial work, but it's more like executive assistant, and she's also making films. And then when it got to the point where everyone understood that making the films was more lucrative, she actually hired a secretary for herself. She had her own secretary, and then she began to make films full time.
And Alice was making a lot of films, like over 1,000 that she either wrote, directed, or produced. And yet, you probably didn't even know they existed.
So the first films that she made were a little bit like when you buy a computer today, the computer will be bundled with fun programs. There'll be some free games, something you can use for word processing, something you can use as a spreadsheet. They give you the basics for free to entice you to buy the machine, to sweeten the deal. Well, that was what they were doing when they made these films. She was making 1-minute films, 20 meters long. And the whole idea was that when gentlemen came to the Gaumont store to buy a camera, she would show a film, project a film for them, or a few films, and then they would buy the camera and a few films would get thrown in with them. But the whole idea was you were selling cameras, and these gentlemen, whether they were explorers or scientists or doctors, they were going to buy the camera and make their own movies. But the films that L.L.C made were there to show them what these cameras could do and to sweeten the deal. So she knew who her audience was. So these films were often a little on the racy side by Victorian standards. So if you look at Feo Shu, we have a remake of it that was made 2 years later. This very beautiful young woman comes out and she's wearing this like shift that's sort of see-through when it's lit up. And then her move consists of bowing down and picking up a baby from behind cabbages and putting it down. And the whole idea was to show off her charms. And her dress is also sleeveless, so she's showing off her arms, which, was pretty scandalous at the time.
In fact, Miss McMahon herself had never seen any of Alice Guy Blachet's very early films. Nobody had, which led many scholars to doubt the claim that Guy Blachet was the first female filmmaker, or in some cases even a filmmaker at all. It's not like her films had been preserved, like so many of the films made by her male contemporaries, such as the Lumiere brothers or George Méliès, until one day, when Allison received a phone call.
I was in Paris doing research, and someone called me from Stockholm, Sweden, and said, "We think we have the Cabbage Fairy film." And for me at that time, the Cabbage Fairy film was like the holy grail, right? But it wasn't the only film. They thought they had more. And I had like 1 day left before I was due to fly back to the States. So I had to fly to Stockholm. I went into their film room. I looked at their films. I had 2 suitcases filled with papers. This is before the internet, before, you couldn't, I just had photocopies. That's what I had, which I had gathered, painstakingly over many years. And then I looked at the films and we spread out the papers and we found the proof we needed and we identified like 7 or 8 films, and then I packed it all up. I got on a plane. I flew back to Paris, and then I flew back to the States. I got no sleep.
But I bet you it was a thrill.
It was a thrill when we, the guy who ran the archive the professor who'd invited me, he invited me to lunch, and we had a bottle of champagne. We were so excited over our find. We knew that we had, that it changed everything, because there are some scholars still today who like to call Alice Guy a liar because they can't find her first film. And then I found it that day, and it looked exactly the way she said it was going to look. And even though we knew from the sprocket hole design and everything that it was made in 1899, it was made 2 years later, or 3 years later, it still showed that she was making films when she said she did. So it put a lot of naysayers to shame. It was a good day.
Simone, Alice Guy Blachet's oldest daughter, never doubted her mother's claims. In her later years, Guy Blachet would regale her daughter with her cinematic exploits, but she had no proof to share. It was as if the world didn't care about her pioneering contributions. Film historian Cecile Starr felt otherwise.
When I started my job, and I talked to Cecile Starr, we knew of about 40, most of them from her American period, because those were the films that had credits on them. By the time I was done with my research, we were up to 115. And since then, other people, using the information in my book, using new information that they found themselves, but just being educated, found about 50 more. So now we're up to about 155. When Alice Guy died, she thought about 3 of her films survived. Out of more than 1,000 that she produced, wrote, or directed, or supervised, more than 1,000, and more than 22 of those were features, what we today call feature-length films. She thought none of them survived.
Alice Guy Blaché died on March 24th, 1968. And this is where our history lesson begins.
Her contribution to cinema was unbelievably important. And her contribution was that she basically taught those of us who came after her, even 100, 150 years later, she taught us how to tell stories on film. She was the one who invented cinematic language as we know it. Now that's a big claim. A lot of people don't understand it. It's a little complicated to explain. But the reason that I can say this without a shadow of a doubt is because she understood that you had a lead character in a story and that the story needed to stay with that lead character and look at things not just from his perspective, because remember, they didn't have point of view shots. So accomplishing this was very difficult. In fact, for the first 5 or 6 years, they didn't even have more than single shot films. But she figured out how to do this even when she was working with single shot films within one frame. So she taught everyone else how to do it. And other people like Ferdinand Zecca, who was working over at Pathé, and Méliès would see her films and they would try to do what she was doing and they wouldn't get it.
So wait, she created the structure of narrative film as we know it, and the history books just kind of skipped over that point?
So you can look, and I've done this in my book, I've compared a series of films. So say Alice made a film about a boy whose father is, he's a game warden. So the father goes out to work looking for poachers, and his older son, who's about 12, follows him. You know, he wants to see what dad does all day. And he happens to witness his father getting murdered by these poachers who don't like the game warden interfering with what they're doing. So the boy then follows the poachers, chases them, finds out where they are, and chases one guy until he falls off of the very same cliff where they murdered his father. And at the end, you see the boy, his younger brother, and the mother. They're all clustered around the fallen body of the father, and they're all mourning together. So this story very clearly follows the psychological development of this boy. He starts out as a kid who's sneaking around, trying to get away with something. Then he sees something terrible happen. Then he goes and he gets justice for his father, and then he stands by his mother and mourns. But the way that the characters are placed around the father's body, you can tell that he is now ready to assume his father's role. His mother is mourning, but he is standing next to her. I call it a pietà arrangement because the arrangement is similar to the arrangement of people at the foot of the cross in Passion films, which were also being made at the same time.
Okay. I suddenly feel schooled.
So Ferdinand Zecca over at Pathé tried to copy this film, and in some ways the film is better, some of the action is better, but he didn't get the whole psychic thing of just following one character's psychological perspective, his emotional development. He kind of jumps from the father to the bad guy. At the end, it's focused on the mother, and he makes a beautiful pietà scene, but he misses the fact that what gave Alice's film its power was following the psychological development of this one child.
How does that saying go again? Imitation is the best form of flattery?
Alice developed these techniques without close-ups, at first without editing, and of course, as we know, without sound, and even without intertitles. It was really, really difficult, but if you look at the films of hers that we have, you can see that she figured out how to do this by trial and error. It wasn't until the gravitational center of the film industry moved to the United States, which didn't happen until about 1912, that American filmmakers began to pick up on these techniques and learn them. Hitchcock is on the record as saying that he started out making silent films that he learned in the beginning by watching films made by Alice Guy Blaché.
Many of my listeners know that my production company, Cryptic Pictures, likes to draw the line between fantasy and reality pretty close. But I assure you, this is no made-up story.
In 1902, Gaumont, his focus was always on the machines. He invented a system called the Gaumont chronophone, which was a synchronized sound machine. And Gaumont wanted to expand the sales of his chronophone system into Spain. She was opening markets for Gaumont. Later, Gaumont sent her to Berlin, Germany, to do the same thing. The one thing that really began to chafe her is that her contributions to the company were completely unrecognized. Unlike, say, an American firm today, somebody who had come up through the ranks and done all of that would have been asked to be partner or would have been given a VP title as a way of recognizing their contributions, or they would have been invited to join the board, something like that. Because she was a woman, she was never given that recognition or asked to do any of those things.
Realizing that there wasn't much upward mobility in her job, Guy Blaché eventually married her husband Herbert. He also worked for Gaumont, and the two of them traveled to America at the company's request.
The world of silent cinema was a world where the films were universal. The films could go all around the world. All of a sudden, you're adding sound to them in 1906, 1907, 1908. They're not universal anymore. It's language by language, country by country, territory by territory. So now they need to produce films in English for an American market. So the job he gave to Herbert was to oversee the construction of a studio in Flushing, New York, which wasn't part of New York City at that time. And Herbert was supposed to oversee the production of sound films there. And L.L.C was producing sound films there, although she wasn't on payroll. She was just helping out, but she was a seasoned director. So she started out making some films, mostly musical numbers. And Lois Weber was an actress and a singer, and she was cast in some of these films. And after she'd been in a few, Alice was pregnant enough that she had to quit working. She couldn't show up at work every day. And once she had to leave the scene, Lois Weber said, could I try my hand at directing some of these? And that is how she got her entree into filmmaking, becoming the world's second female filmmaker. Many of the old film school books credit her as being the first woman filmmaker, but that's because they have an American bias. She was the first American woman filmmaker, but obviously Alice had had a whole career before Lois Weber even knew that movies were a thing.
Weber wasn't the only competition Guy Blaché and her husband faced. America brought with it a whole host of new struggles to contend with.
So basically, Herbert is a Gaumont employee, so whatever affects Gaumont affects them, even though they're in the States. Then Gaumont runs into a problem named Thomas Edison. So Thomas Edison had invented a device. He'd invented the kinetoscope, and then he'd invented something called the kinetophone, which it never really worked. But Edison actually wasn't too particular about whether something worked or not. He only cared about who had the patent. And it was clear to him that Gaumont's chronophone system was vastly superior to the kinetophone. And he was not happy about having this competition. So he took Gaumont to court. It dragged on like 2 years. Meanwhile, while all this is happening, Gaumont isn't, he had been ordered to abstain from film production until the court case was resolved. Basically, Herbert is now in charge of this studio that's empty. Nothing is happening. It's costing all this money. They just built it. There's mortgage. There's overhead costs. And Alice says, what gives? This place is empty. And then he tells her what's going on. And then she finally has an idea. And she says, I can start my own company. I can make films. I can rent the studio space from Gaumont. He can distribute the films when they're done, and we share the profits.
The film history books credit much of Alice Guy Blaché's work to her husband Herbert, and rectifying that historical record has been a very slow and arduous process.
Legally, Herbert was a partner of Solex when it was first formed, but in actual fact, Alice ran the company. She directed all the films for it. She went right to work, even though she had a baby. She had the baby in the studio with her, and she started out making 1 10-minute film a week. By now, they had multiple scenes, they were edited, they had English intertitles, and Then she was making 3 a week, so it would take one day to film them, and then some post-production, and then every week there were 3 new releases, and then it was 5 a week. And then she had so many that she couldn't keep up with the demand herself, so she hired 2 assistant directors. One of them, Wilbert Melville, went on to work for Lubin and took all the studio management practice he learned from Alice and applied them to Lubin. So you could say that part of Lubin's success was that he had Melville, and Melville learned it all from Alice.
Alice was not only the first female film producer, not only the first female director, but also the industry's first female studio head with her production company called Solex, which was based in New York.
During this time, Alice was making money hand over fist. She bought a house, she had nannies, she sent her kids to fancy boarding schools, and then she built a studio, and she went deeply into hock for this studio, way too deep, not knowing that the writing was already on the wall and that all of the things that she counted on to guarantee her success were already in play, not knowing how much everything is going to change.
A person can fall many times in life, but they aren't a failure until they choose not to get up.
By 1912, it became clear, first of all, that Gaumont was going to close up shop, at least not make chronophone films anymore. And it also became clear that the studio in Flushing wasn't big enough, and more importantly, there wasn't enough variety of scenery around the area for Solex, which was the name of Alice's company. Alice realized she needed a bigger studio. She needed her own studio. She's pregnant with her second child, but she decides to build her own studio. So the question then becomes, where did she get the money? Well, she was part of a employee stock sharing plan with Gaumont, and Gaumont had refinanced his business, and she used her Gaumont stock, and basically that was half of what it cost to build the studio, and the rest was a mortgage. But the deal was basically still the same. She was making these movies, and Gaumont was distributing them.
Okay, we can now add female entrepreneur to Alice's list of firsts.
So she opened the studio, but almost from the beginning, it was doomed because she relied on Gaumont for distribution. And Gaumont had access to what was called licensed distribution. They were in a situation that was sort of similar to our situation even today. You have the Hollywood studios. Few of them make their own films anymore. What they do is they do negative pickups, so they commission films and then they distribute them. All their clout comes from having control of distribution. And then there are the indie filmmakers who sort of try their luck, and hope that quality will break through and they will find their audience. So that was true for them too, because Edison, again, is the bad guy in all of this story. He had started something called the Moving Picture Trust, Moving Picture Patents Company. Some people just called it the trust. And if you were part of his group, the MPPC group, you paid him this huge licensing fee. And if you paid him this huge licensing fee, then you had access to what was called licensed distribution, which basically meant you were guaranteed sales. Your films, regardless of quality or lack of, would go into a hopper and they would get packaged into programs and they would get sold and well, at first it was rented, but then it was sold and they would get distributed, and you could predict that today it would be seen in New Jersey, and 3 months from now it would be seen in L.A., and then next year it would be seen in South America, and they'd be watching some very scratchy used up prints. That was guaranteed. And Gaumont was part of this licensing group. If you were not part of this licensing group, you had to go yourself to these marketing meetings. It was called states' rights, and you would have to try to sell the rights to your films or your slate of films or your program state by state. So if you look in the trades at the time, you see state rights programs. And they had some people opening companies saying, come and do things our way, sign up with us, and we can make sure that you'll get sold and you'll get distributed, and usually a lot of those companies were fly by night and didn't deliver. So indies had it really tough.
What else is new?
So at first, Alice and Sol.X are selling films through Gaumont. Gaumont is a member of the MPPC. He has access to licensed distribution. The court case is only about his sound system. His silent films are still being packaged and sold. What happens is that World War I starts in France. And long before World War I started, all the tensions that led up to World War I were making themselves felt in the States too. And just as we see now, we're at war with someone, so we start identifying any member of that nationality or culture as bad. Well, French were getting labeled as these amoral foreigners who made these amoral foreign films, Well, the French were not as prudish as we are, so it's true that their films were a little racier, but I wouldn't go as far as calling them amoral. That was just propaganda because the American filmmakers were trying to elbow these guys out of the market so that they could stake it out for themselves, especially Edison.
Geez, has anything changed in the industry over the last 100 years?
So once Gaumont lost his court case with Edison over the sound films, and then he starts getting hit on the other side of these critique of the amoral French films and don't go see these films and don't buy these films. And the war starts in France, and he decides to close up his American business and go back to France and make films for the French government, like contribute to the war effort with his films, basically make war propaganda films and informational films. Once Edison won his court case, he said, well, I don't want you as part of my group of licensed film people. So now Sol.X joins the ranks of the independents. At that point, Alice says to Herbert, look, I am busy directing. I have all these films I have to make. I have these directors working under me. I have to supervise them. I have too much work. You take over as president of Sol.X. And in her mind, what he should do was do those state rights meetings and sell the films. Unfortunately, Herbert was watching her, be the boss and be so successful. And one of the things I didn't mention earlier is that Herbert was 8 years younger than she was. So he's now reached an age where he wants to be the successful businessman. But so far, everything he's done while they were married has not worked out. Not necessarily his fault, but it hasn't worked out. He's basically had a string of failures. Well, everything Alice has done is turned into gold.
Herbert did eventually leave Alice, divorcing her in 1922, and this was long after Alice had taught him everything she knew about the industry.
That probably didn't lead to happy dinner hours at home, but anyway, he needed a job. She gave him one. Basically, his attitude was, what I really want to do is direct. So she actually did train him to direct. He directed a couple of films while he was still working for Gaumont, and they were released under her name because it was a conflict of interest. If he was working for Gaumont, he shouldn't be directing films for Sol.X. But now he's supposed to be doing these sales, but he's not really concentrating on it. He still wants to direct. She's trying to keep him happy. She still has a full slate. There's too much work to do. So they start working together. But by 1914, it was clear that they weren't going to be able to make those mortgage payments. And the other thing that was happening is that the industry is moving to what we now call feature-length films. They went from one reel, which was Alice's strength, to 2 reels. Alice made quite a few of those, to 3 reels, and then to 5 reels. And 5 reels is, they're 15 minutes each, so that's 75 minutes. That's a bigger budget, right? And you have to, if you're an independent, you have to have that budget up front, then you make the film, and then you try to make a profit so that you can make the next one. Well, when you were working on 1 reel film budgets, it was possible to do that, but with 5 reel budgets, it became more and more difficult. So they did what other companies have done, what people always do when they need money. They formed a new company and they looked for investors. And that new company was called Blaché Features, and it was promoted as Herbert and Alice would both be directing for the company. And they did do that for about a year and a half. They were directing features. This killer schedule. Alice would direct a feature and Herbert would produce it in 1 month. And then the next month, Alice would produce a feature that Herbert directed. And they did this month after month after month. Alice did 22 films on that arrangement, and then Herbert must have done just as many. Most of them are lost. We don't have any of those films, which is a pity because the press we read about them is very interesting. But that wasn't enough to keep them afloat either. So finally they became directors for hire for bigger companies. By 1917, that's what they were doing, and they were renting the Solex studio out to other companies. And one company actually that started a fire by accident. So in 1919, most of the studio burnt down, and soon after that, Alice had to declare bankruptcy.
And this is where legacy steps in, where we rewrite the history books to give proper credit where proper credit is due.
There's this one guy who wrote a film anthology with all these directors, and he said, well, you're over-romanticizing her. And I said, no, I have done this research. Just because you don't know about it doesn't mean it's not true, but it's there. So then he writes a 2-paragraph entry on her and says that her career has been over-romanticized. That was in the first hardback publication. Now he has the same information online and he's changed his tune quite a bit now that my book has come out. That was what my first book was up against. I was basically directing it to film scholars who would just assume, they would say things, L.L.C was Gaumant's mistress, otherwise he would never have let her make films. Well, that was a rumor started by a guy, Victorine Jassette, who was one of her second unit directors in 1906, and she had to fire him for statutory rape. Statutory rape was not against the law in France at the time. He had seduced a minor. Apparently, the girl was willing, but she was still a child. So Alice, the mother came and complained to Alice that the girl was now unmarriageable, and Alice fired the guy. And well, Alice and Gaumont were, in their personal values, were very conservative. They were both horrified by this. And Jassette said, I'm going to tell Gaumont on you. And he went to Gaumont, and Gaumont said, oh no, you are most certainly fired. You are never working for me. You're not working in this town again. Jassette had to then go, basically he went to the States to continue his career. But he was angry. So then he began spreading a rumor that the only reason Alice had her job was because she was Gaumant's mistress. In his mind, that was tit for tat. He did not deserve to be fired for statutory rape. And he was going to get back at her for soiling his, I don't quite understand the logic of this. But anyway, the scholars all believe him, and they don't believe her. And the fact that Gaumont backed her up means never mind to that, So they just believe that she must have been Gaumant's mistress. And then, there are all these people after the First World War trying to get jobs in film. Alice is in the States. So they start saying, oh yeah, I directed this film for Gaumont. I directed that film for Gaumont. There's no credits on it. So who's going to know? And then they use that to get jobs. So then all the film scholars interviewing these guys at the end of their lives put all that into the history books. And then Alice gets completely erased.
So how long does it take to rewrite history? About the same amount of licks as it takes to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop.
It took me 10 years of full-time effort. 10 years. It was unjust what had happened to Alice. It was unfair, and I just wanted to make this wrong right.
And we thank Miss McMahon for her dedication towards seeing Alice's story told and history finally corrected.
We now have, like I said, 150 plus of her films. You can get all the Gaumont films that survive on DVD. You can get a lot of the American films on DVD. New DVD packages are about to come out from Kino Lorber. Marquise Lepage's documentary Made in Canada was widely circulated, and then my book is still out there. It's still in print. It's still available in ebook form.
Well, if Alice's story was lost for nearly 100 years, what of the other female pioneers of the industry? Have no fear. we've got you covered.
There's a website called the Women Film Pioneers Project. Jane Gaines, who's a professor at Columbia University, is sort of the figurehead of it, but mostly it's run by researchers and graduate students. And basically, they have long, detailed articles with sources and filmographies on hundreds of female filmmakers. From, when I talked about L.L.C being the first female filmmaker in the first 12 years of the world, remember I very carefully said professional, because there were women out there. There were women mountain climbers who took cameras with them and filmed themselves climbing up the mountains and the view from the top when they got there. Now, they weren't professional filmmakers, but they were making movies. They weren't getting paid for it. And then there were many other people. There were women in Japan and women in South America and women everywhere. And, I'm not going to say all of them are listed there, but you get, it's the most complete list that you could find.
So now knowing of Alice Guy Blachet's legacy and where to find others like it, how do we place this story into a modern context in order to help inspire the next generation of female filmmakers?
In 1993, I became aware, I was writing this book on Tim Burton, and I became aware of the transition from analog film to digital. And I knew that that was going to be a major, by 1998, it was clear that 1993 was this huge watershed in film. Basically, in my opinion, although this might sound extreme, but I think 1993 was like the end of movies as we know them. We're really now in an era of television, and television has also gone digital, and that has really changed. And if you ask me who my role models are, the closest that we have to Alice Guy today are female showrunners in television. The Shonda Rhimes, the woman who is a showrunner for Westworld. There's so many of them now, and even I can't name them, even though I'm fans of their shows. It is, again, we don't really hear about the female showrunners. Some male showrunners have become kind of rock stars, like, the guys who made Game of Thrones or Boardwalk Empire, or Ronald Moore doing Outlander, but he was already well known for other things he'd done. But try to name people apart from Shonda Rhimes, or, those women are doing incredible things. All of the leaps ahead in narrative and cinematic narrative right now are all happening in streaming television. They're also happening in interactive narratives, i.e. video games, so that's a whole different thing. You already know that women are having a tough time there too. Basically, if there's money to be made, people will get very competitive. And if they can say, women cannot make movies, or women aren't good at television, let's push them out, let's take all the money ourselves. If they can get away with that, they will do it. And it's not just women, it's filmmakers of color, it's, everybody. That is still a problem. And it's not just simple misogyny, it's really about keeping the whole pie.
Sounds like it's time to share the pie. And believe me, there's enough to go around. No one should have to go hungry in this industry. I thank you for joining us today. Stay tuned, because we have plenty more episodes centered on women in film, their legacies, their contributions, their struggles, and their triumphs. Who knows? The next pioneer could be you. If you have a story to share, reach out. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, this is Mark Ritchie with Crypticast.